Hello friends, in the series which we are doing in issues in world history 20th century, today we will talk about industrialization. And as we are aware that industrialization was a comparatively a process in the 18th century and how it grew over a period of time, and it occurred in Britain largely. And we talk about industrialization in the also in the framework of industrial revolution, and how this kind of industrialization in Britain, France, Germany and other nations of Europe, that has also been talked about, and it is talked in the framework of the capitalist development in these countries. And when we talk about these kinds of aspects, we find that how capitalism was the first stage in the history of the world to coincide with the phenomena of industrialization in its full blown form. And we find that the new economic institutions and new technology in Marxist terms, relations and the means of productions, and how it transformed the world as well, how the kind of changes which came in the world because of the industrial activity, this we have also seen. And when one talks about industrial revolution, when one talks about industrialization, it is largely connected with the technical progress, and because it is one of the essential characteristics of the capitalist advance. And we also find that how when you talk about the technical progress, it is a never ending process. When we see the contemporary times, that the kind of changes which began in the early part of the 20th century and thereafter, we find that these kinds of technical changes or progress, it continued over a period of time. And we also see that the kind of changes which it brought about, and how these kinds of changes, they have been diffused throughout in various kinds of ways. And when you talk about the technological developments, we find that these kinds of progress, how it has in a way improved the kind of changes which have come in the lives of the human beings by bringing some kind of a better standard of living. But at the same time, they have also been criticized on the ground that how because of too much industrial activity, how it affected the environment as well. So we see that some kind of changes which were brought about in the natural resources because of the introduction of the new technology, and how labor power, it also got changed in that sense when we find that industrial activity made its impact. And when you talk about, when one is talking about industrial activity, then we find that you have to have some kind of an investment to bring about that kind of a change. And when one is making investment, it is also imperative that that country or that economy shall have the kind of resources, it shall have the kind of surplus which can be invested. In that sense, people, they should have some kind of savings, the government should have revenue surplus, so that this kind of an investment could be made. And when you talk about the kind of developments which have taken place over a period of time in the framework of the capitalist growth, or we find that how the role of the capitalist and the pre-capitalist industry is also very important in that context. And we find that when you talk about capitalist industrialization, we find one of the major driving forces is the strong propensity to risk capital on the new techniques that hold promise of improved profits. That how the people, those who are investing the kind of money in bringing about changes in the framework of the new techniques, so they have to have that kind of a desire, they have to have that kind of a entrepreneurship to risk their capital on the new techniques, because over a period of time these new techniques are going to bear profits to them. And so in that sense, the kind of earlier defensive wariness was there of the pre-capitalist approach to technology would be replaced with the kind of approach in the new times. And when you talk about modern industry, then we find that how science is being applied to the industry as one of the important characteristics of the modern industry. And we also find that this view is in a way charming or attractive in that sense, but this view also had its own problems. And when we talk about the 18th century dawn of the modern industry, and the kind of scientific knowledge in that sense which was available was also very weak and slender to be applied directly to the industrial processes. And we find that during that time, how these scientific inventions which took place and how they were in a way applied to the modern industry, in that sense they brought about the kind of development. So because before the industrial revolution, we talk about the agricultural revolution in Britain, and we also talk about the kind of developments which were happening in France as well. And there is a whole lot of debate with regard to that why industrial revolution took place in Britain only, why this kind of a change first could have taken place in France and any other country as well. So we find that if we see the kind of stages, it was not until the second half of the 19th century, with the flowering of the chemical and the electrical sciences, that scientific theories, they provided foundations for the new processes and new industries as well. And it has also been in a way disputed, or it has also been questioned, however, that as early as 17th century, the methods of science, in particular observation and experiment, they were also being applied for utilitarian purposes as well. So in that context, whether they were successful or they were not successful, that was altogether a different kind of matter. So we find that these kinds of ideas which are related to observation and experiment, which were in a way concerned with science, they were also being used in the utilitarian purposes as well. And we also see that such kind of efforts, they were not limited to the men of scientific training. And when you talk about one of the most remarkable features of technical advance in the 18th and the 19th century, it was the large proportion of the major inventions which was made by indigenous tinkerers, self-taught mechanics and engineers. And that is how the word engineer acquired its modern meaning in 18th century, and other kinds of aspects which were associated with it. And we find that when you talk about engineering, which is very vital to science in that sense, and nowadays we have so many different branches of engineering, and in that context mechanical engineering is one which is concerned with the motor activity in that sense, and how mechanical engineering brought about a lot of changes, especially in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century and thereafter. And when you talk about terms like experimental method, then it may be too formal and exact to describe the process. So trial and error may be more apposite or more appropriate in that context, because when you talk about this kind of a technique called trial and error, we find that how people, those who were undergoing or those who were bring about this kind of a change in the society with their research, with their inventions, we find that they were able to engage in this idea of trial and error, and then they came out with these kinds of inventions. And but one of the important aspects which is associated with it is the willingness to experiment and to innovate, and it was there in different strata of the society, all strata of the society. They were ready to experiment and innovate. Even the agricultural population, as we talk about the agricultural revolution which happened in Britain, and how agricultural population had been earlier traditionally more conservative and suspicious of any kind of innovation, but during this time we find that the kind of changes which were brought about in the agricultural technology, how they gave some kind of a thrust to the industrial revolution in Britain. And we see, when one is talking about technology, we find that how the use of machinery and the mechanical power to transform the task that had been done far more slowly earlier, and now with the use of machines they could be done in a more faster way. And earlier we find that the human or animal power was being used and it was very laborious in nature, but this kind of a change where we find that the mechanical power that was being used and how it in a way changed the industry in that sense in terms of production as well as productivity. We find that more and more production took place, and the productivity also increased because of that. And we find that elementary machines like wheel, pulley and lever had been used from antiquity, because they have been there in the history, and for centuries humankind, they had also used fraction of inanimate powers of nature to in a way propel the sailing ships and actuate windmills and watermills for the rudimentary industrial purposes. So we find that all these kinds of mechanisms, they had been in use earlier as well, and how inanimate powers of nature, they were also being used earlier as well for the rudimentary industrial purposes. But we find that the 18th century brought about a lot of changes in the use of water power, which occurred in the industries such as grain milling and textiles and metallurgy. So that these kind of changes, they came during this time, and how artificial or synthetic materials, they also came in a very major way, because of which we find that it not only changed the consumption, that how when new industries came with new kind of products, we find that how these kinds of new products, they were being very well welcomed by the people, and in that sense we find that capitalist industrialization was some kind of a boon for the industry at that point of time. And we also see that it was also very important from the point of view of the masses as well, the people, those who were using these kinds of products. So when you talk about the various thinkers, that how these thinkers, they have tried to see industrialization, then we see that when you see the works of Marx and Engels, then how their concept, when their ideas, they are being talked about, these kinds of idea of industrialization is absent from their work. And we also see that how Karl Marx, he distinguishes the modern industry or the factory system or the machinery system from the earlier forms of the capitalist production, cooperation and manufacture. So we find that during this time, the important developments which were happening during this particular period, and the ideas of the modern industry or the factory system or the machinery system which came during this time, and these kinds of distinctions, they have also been made, and how Marx, he talks about these kinds of distinctions. So we find that these kinds of concepts, they became very relevant during this particular point of time, and when you try to analyze them in 18th century and 19th century in the through the prism of the eyes of the thinkers, those who have seen these kinds of developments which were happening at that point of time. So we find that thinkers like Marx and Engels, they do not use such kind of technology, because such kind of technology could have only be seen in the later times. And even when you talk about the modern industry or the factory system, especially when you talk about the factory system in the 18th century, it was also only in the incipient stage. And even the machineries which were being made in the 18th century, and how the development of machineries over a period of time took place. And we see how when you are talking about modern industry, how it is being distinguished from manufacture by the central role of machinery and tools which had been converted from being manual implements of men into implements of a mechanical apparatus of a machine. Motive mechanism also acquired an independent form, entirely emancipated from restraints of human strength. So in that sense, we find that how machinery was very important, and earlier tools which were being used by men, now we find that when you are talking about the mechanical apparatus, where we are talking about machines, and how over a period of time we find that individual machine sinks into a mere factor in production by machinery, where we find that people they are working on the big machines, and how these machines, they are producing more and more, the production was also increasing, as well as the productivity as well. And when you talk about manufacture, Marx also talks about, or he distinguishes two stages in the development of the machinery system. And he says that in the first system, simple cooperation, there is only a conglomeration in factory of similar and simultaneously acting machines using a single power source. And the second stage, we find a complex system of machinery. Product goes through a connected series of detailed processes which are carried out by an interlinked chain of machines. So we find that how the machinery system, it also became more complex over a period of time. And when this complex system was perfected, we and can carry out entire process of production with workers only as attendants, it becomes an automatic system of machinery. And this we see nowadays in many aspects, where we find that how over a period of time, the labor which was being required, it was only required as an attendant, because machinery was doing most of the work. And we find that this kind of a development of machinery is not only in the products which are being made for the factory, but we find that how consumer products, where the products which are being used by the consumers at home, they have also become a lot more mechanical in that sense. And nowadays in every household we have so many machines which are being used on day-to-day basis. So we see that how, when you talk about the hand operated tools and how they were being converted into the instruments of a machine, and the way the worker was being reduced to a mere source of motive power, and how over a period of time, when the production expanded and the limits of the human strength necessitated the substitution of mechanical motive power for the human muscles, because now more and more was to be produced. And we find that when you are talking about the factory system, where we find that machines, they are driven by a single motive force, that is the steam engine. And scholars, they have talked about these kinds of ideas, and David Landers, he placed the technology at the center of the industrial revolution, and he introduces this book by listing three areas of material advance that comprise the heart of industrial revolution. And in his work Unbound Prometheus, he talks about the substitution of the mechanical devices for human skills, that how mechanical devices, they have become more important, and how human skills over a period of time, they were not being used when you talk about this kind of a system. Inanimate power in the framework of the steam, that how it took place of the human and the animal strength. And thirdly, there was a marked improvement in getting and working of the raw materials, especially in what are now known as metallurgical and chemical industries. So we find that these kinds of ideas which are being talked about by David Landers in his work, and over a period of time we have also seen that how inanimate power is being used in the machinery system or the factory system, and how mechanical devices, they have replaced the human skills in different industries. And then we find that how the mechanical and the chemical industries, they also became more and more industrial in that sense. More and more machinery was being used in these industries. And some of the scholars like Theodore Hamero, they has measured the course of this technological modernization in different European countries by citing the rising number of patents, capacity of the steam engines and their diffusion in production, concentration of labor in the factories, and the increase in the efficiency of manufacture by way of rises in output per man hour. So we find that how this kind of a development in this framework, where we talk about technological modernization in various European countries, where we find that more and more patents, they were seen how different elements of the industrialization process, how they were there, and how they in a way were in a way catering to more and more patents during this time, and how steam engines, they increased or expanded their capacity at this point of time. And we also see that how concentration of labor also increased in the factories which were producing more and more, and some kind of increase in the efficiency of manufacture also took place by the rise in the output per man hour. So, we see that capitalist industrialization definitely played an important role from this particular framework, and we will talk about some of the thinkers in our next lecture. Thank you very much.